Welcome back to the National Post Politics Bureau, where it's actually the day after Mark Carney won the Liberal leadership race. And we're going to talk about that a little bit, but we kind of want to talk about a new way we're analyzing politics. And one of the things I think we were looking at early on with Mark Carney in this race was if you looked at betting markets, predictions markets, people who are actually putting money on the line about who would win this race, Carney was a lock from the beginning. And we had a lot of discussions on the Hill here talking about will Christopher Freeland win, will Karina Gould win, will Mark Carney win? But I think the people who were putting money on it didn't have any question there. And I'm just curious, Chris, do you think this is a tool we can use to analyze these races?
I think it's a really interesting metric in the sense that betting markets kind of combine two variables, what we call the bookies, or people who calculate these odds, presumably in Vegas, consider are the chances of something happening, or like Carney getting elected or becoming Liberal leader, etc., but also where people are putting their money. There are people who are obviously not wise with their money when they bet, but fundamentally, when bettors and betting markets are setting odds, you're kind of combining where do people think that they will get value and or is the most likely outcome, and what do people whose job, the bookies, to set the lines think is going to happen. So, as you said, an excellent example, if you looked at a lot of the betting lines that kind of came throughout this very short Liberal leadership race, Carney was mostly a lock throughout. And what was fascinating ultimately was that Christopher Freeland was a somewhat distant second, not quite as distant as she ended up finishing. As we know, she got 8% of the vote, I believe, for Mark Carney's 86. But fundamentally, all the other candidates that were other than Mark Carney were very far in the odds. And so when you're kind of looking at betting odds, it's really interesting to see where people are fundamentally putting their money. And I think it's a very interesting way to analyze voter behavior for a certain subset of voters.
Yeah, well, there's betting odds. There's also these predictions markets like Polymarket and places like that where it's not actually bookies, it's just pure markets. It's people betting on an outcome.
Yep.
And another place where we saw that, I think, predict the future, maybe this was pretty easy to predict anyways, but Doug Ford winning the Ontario election, where I don't think it got below 90% odds that he would do that. So we have a federal election coming up. I just checked polymarket.com odds on who is going to be the prime minister after that election. Could be a minority, could be a majority. It's showing Pierre Poilievre at 63%. Yeah. Mark Carney's in the mid-30s after his win. Should we take that as a good indicator of what's going to happen? I'll tell you, some of my Liberal friends will tell you because these markets are crypto-based, that they're over-leveraged towards Poilievre. What do you think is going on here?
I don't think that it's an incorrect assumption in the sense that these betting markets really only represent a subset of people, a very specific subset of people, bettors or cryptocurrency users, and depending on which market we're talking about. But I'll give you a good example where Polymarket kind of nailed it versus my prediction, and it was on the chances of the Donald Trump tariffs coming in. So before the end of the month of January. So as we know, President Donald Trump had constantly harped since about November that on the day of his inauguration, January 20th, there would be across the board 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods. And he kept saying it. He kept saying it's going to happen. It's day one. I mean, I fundamentally believed it. I didn't really have a reason not to. He kept saying he would. But on markets like Polymarket, for example, the chances that he actually did implement tariffs before the end of the month was at about 11%.
Yeah.
That's what people had bought into. And that's despite all the news saying he would do it and all that. So it represents a portion of the market that I think is a little bit more skeptical, Polymarket in particular, skeptical of kind of the official line of things. It can be either a very risk-averse or a super risk-heavy market, depending on what the bet is. But fundamentally, and they won't always be right, obviously, but they do bring a very particular perspective. And I think when people are willing to put money where their thoughts lie, it at very least gives a suggestion of how a certain portion of the population, where their psyche is at. Yeah. And in this case, they totally didn't believe Trump was going to do it. In this case, they were correct.
Yeah, and we'll be watching the markets on the federal election, see where it goes. It is actually something that I enjoy is if somebody has a contrarian opinion, if somebody comes to you and says, hey, Chrystia Freeland's going to win the Liberal leadership race, I could tell them, hey, if you bet $100 on that, you could win $2,000. So don't waste your time telling me your opinions. So we'll be back to talk about this stuff. I'm sure it's going to be really interesting as a federal election looms. So thanks for watching.